Clara Voss left in a hurry the night the city learned how much grief could look like. A winter rain had made the streets shine like the inside of a coin, and her footsteps were the only honest sound. She had a coat, Jonah Hale's old wool coat, loaned in a warmer season as an afterthought, and when she walked away, she did not notice the small bundle stowed in its inner pocket. A folded Polaroid, a receipt from a cafe that still smelled of cardamom, a pressed violet, and a hand-lettered note that began, "For when you forget who you are." Jonah would find those things days later, after the coat returned home in a laundry bag and after the world had kept turning as if it hadn't watched Clara vanish. Finding the bundle would not be the end of anything. It would be the beginning of a slow excavation, of memory, regret, and an unexpected tenderness that neither of them knew how to accept. This is a story about how we lose pieces of ourselves on other people, and how the act of finding them, deliberately, gently, becomes a strange, urgent way to learn to belong again. It begins with a leaving, but it will not end there. Clara never meant to hurt anyone. She meant, in the small, precise ways she could control, to be brave. So when the gallery's opening night turned into an interrogation, whispers circling her like birds at a carcass, she hadn't expected the taste of betrayal. The exhibition was supposed to be her salvation. A series of photographs documenting her childhood neighborhood, the shabby lavender houses that smelled of bleach and summer, the faces that had taught her patience. She had poured months into the series, had arranged the images until each one sang. But someone, a critic with a trimmed mustache and an appetite for spectacle, called her work sentimental, then louder, manufactured. In the hush that followed, laughter bloomed like black mold. "You're appropriating," another voice said. It was sharp, younger, a voice used to being believed. "You're selling nostalgia you didn't earn." Clara felt each word like cold hands pressing against her ribs. She had been an insider there once, a kid who knew how to make fireworks with a bic and a willing crowd. But the room had folded into strangers. Faces she had invited looked at her as if she were a plant they had discovered in the wrong pot. Jonah stood beside her, palms tucked into the pockets of his coat, his expression carefully neutral. He had been her steady since art school, generous with critique, honest with praise, and that night his silence felt like a ledger settling. After the panel, the critic's words replayed in Clara's head like a scratched record. Each replay built the sense that she had been exposed, that the shy, private parts of her life were on display for judgment. An acquaintance came up with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Everyone's talking." "It's interesting." The adjective was a blade. She retreated to the small kitchen behind the gallery, knees threatening to buckle. "I didn't fake anything," she whispered to the chipped sink, to the darkness that accepted her. "I just wanted to tell the truth." Jonah arrived minutes later carrying 2 plastic cups of stale coffee. He made no attempt to sound clever. He only set a cup beside her and said, "You did what you wanted to do." It sounded like defense. He drew the coat off his shoulders and shrugged it near her, an offering. "Take it. It'll keep you warm." She accepted it because his presence felt more honest than the applause she hadn't meant to need. She tucked the coat around her shoulders and felt the wool fold like a hand. It smelled of his steady life, cedar shelves, and the faint metallic tang of his workshop. She placed a trembling hand inside the inner pocket and felt paper. For a second she imagined it was a letter he'd written, a modest confession of love. But when she pulled out the Polaroid, she felt something else entirely. Intimacy scattered in the form of small objects that worked like anchors. There was a pressed violet between 2 pages, its petals a faded royal blue. A cafe receipt for a hot chocolate nodded to an afternoon they'd argued and then forgiven. A photo of her grandmother, smiling with a missing tooth. And folded, like a secret folded to smallness, a note in Clara's own handwriting. She didn't remember writing it. She read the first line aloud, and the words were double-edged. "For when you forget who you are." She laughed because the room was too narrow for sobbing, and Jonah's face softened. "You put this here?" he asked. Clara's throat closed. "I think I might have. A while ago." Jonah's fingers found hers, not in a possessive squeeze, but like a map-finding. "Maybe we stop telling them what they want to hear and tell them the story as it happened," he murmured, eyes fixed on the photographs still pinned on the gallery wall. "You built this, Clara. Let them take what they will." She left that night wearing Jonah's coat, shoulders rounded as if the wool could hold her upright. Outside, the city seemed to have a new patience. That pocket of objects was a thing she'd find again, later, when she no longer had Jonah's hand to hold. For now, it was an almost literal talisman. She walked past the river that reflected the gallery's neon like a wound and felt, for the first time in months, a sense of vertigo that promised something profound or catastrophic. She could not tell which. The inciting incident was not a single act of cruelty. It was a slow accumulation. The critic's article, the whispered conversations, the way older friends made a show of not understanding. The public questioning had its own velocity, and Clara's private sense of self, which she had fortified with late-night letters and quiet protests, began to fray. The note in the pocket was not only a saving thing. It was evidence that she could disappear and wind up carrying her own past without meaning to. When she reached her apartment, she pushed the coat onto the railing of her balcony and sat on the kitchen floor. The objects spread around her like a constellation. She pressed her fingers to the violet and to the photograph and found her pulse slowed, syllables composing themselves into a new language: survival. But what she did not know in the days that followed was that Jonah would, through a separate chain of events, take the coat back. A misunderstanding at the gallery, a spilled drink, a hurried apology, and the coat returned to him in a laundry bag. The things in its pockets crossed from Clara's possession into Jonah's hands without either of them deciding it. In the raw economy of loss that would come next, a coat would be more than fabric. It would be the repository of memories neither knew how to face. When the coat arrived at Jonah's small apartment above the tool shop, he noticed the weight immediately. He put it down on the couch and fished inside the inner pocket, as one might examine a box found in a drawer. Careful, curious. The Polaroid's edges bit into his thumbs. The photo depicted Clara laughing with her mouth open, eyes scrunched, hair wild in a sun-scraped alley. Jonah had never seen that picture. He had never seen that laugh as captured by someone else. Beneath the Polaroid, the receipt showed a time stamped at 3:12 p.m., the name of a cafe whose windows faced a bookstore they had both loved. He knew, in a nonspecific way, that every item in that pocket was a piece of a map leading somewhere only Clara fully inhabited. Jonah set the items on his kitchen table and ran his thumb across the ink of the note. For a long moment, the apartment was a theater of the small things that make up a life. He felt an ache like an electric current through his ribs, not heartbreak in the cinematic sense, but the dizzying tenderness of being entrusted with someone's past. He wanted to call Clara. He imagined her at home unwrapping the coat and smiling at what she had tucked away and forgotten. But when he tried her number, it went straight to voicemail. The message was full. Clara's voice recorded in that precise cadence she used when she read aloud from books she loved. But the message was not for him. He listened to it once and had to stop. Days passed with Jonah turning the pocket's artifacts in his hands. He took them with him to the workshop, where he filed metal and listened to the steady hum of machines that required straightforward thinking. Friends noticed a change, the way he paused mid-sentence, or the way his gaze softened at small things. "You're distracted," Lena said one night as they drank beers on his stoop. Lena was the kind of friend who asked sharp questions and never stayed for the answer if it made her uncomfortable. "Is it her?" Jonah was truthful and evasive at once. "She left some things in my coat," he said. "Maybe I should have given them back." Lena laughed, but it held no mockery. "People leave their shit everywhere. You could put it in a box labeled Clara, or you could find out what the things mean." Jonah tried the box approach. He wrapped the items in tissue paper and slid them into a shoebox. Then he sealed it in a drawer with bolts and grease. But that night he dreamed of Clara, not younger or older, but as a collection of moments. Standing in the rain, unpacking the coat, folding a letter into the inner pocket and thinking, uncharacteristically, that one day she might need proof that she still belonged to herself. He woke with the same ache. Meanwhile, Clara's life took on new, harsher contours. The critic's column rippled outward in ways she had not anticipated. A friend from college sent a condescending message. A patron who had once promised support sent an awkward apology that read like a withdrawal. Clara started to believe the story everyone told about her. that she'd traded rawness for fashionable narrative, that she had performed memory to garner notices. The more she tried to refute it, the more the accusation hardened into a rumor with its own heartbeat. Once on a subway, a woman recognized her and asked in a tone that mixed pity and hunger, "Is it all real?" The question was a knife point. She spent late nights writing and shredding, writing and burning, a ritual to see if words could be kept honest. In the scratches of ink, she found both refuge and accusation. The note, "For when you forget who you are," became a riddle. When had she written it? Why tuck it away? A memory surfaced like fog. A November afternoon months earlier, when Jonah had held her hand, while she confessed a small, shameful truth about her family. She'd been unmoored and afraid that her past might be weaponized. She must have folded the note then, a promise to herself to remember, should the world forget for her. Clara's avoidance became an ache of its own. She could not bring herself to go back to the gallery and look the critic in the eye. She stopped answering Jonah's texts, and each silence lengthened the distance between them. When they did speak, conversation felt like walking on glass. Jonah wanted to apologize for things he hadn't done, and also to explain the small domesticity of the coat's pocket, as if that would make everything less fragile. Clara needed space to rebuild a sense of self that had been publicly interrogated. One afternoon, Jonah received an email he could not ignore. An offer from a small museum to display some of his carpentry in a communal project about memory. A project seeking donated objects with clear provenance. The curator wanted pieces that carried stories. Jonah thought of the shoebox and the items within, and of Clara's quiet scrapbook of a life. He felt an impulse he could not name. He called Clara. She did not pick up. Instead, he wrote her an email, and the email was half confession and half plea. He told her about the offer, about the curator's words, and about how he couldn't imagine donating anything that belonged to someone else without their permission. "If you want these things exhibited," he typed, "they will have your name on them. If you want them back, they're yours." He wanted to be transparent. He wanted to be right. Clara read the message while the city had gone milk slate outside her window. She felt suddenly furious at herself for letting silence grow like mold, at the critic who had lit a match, at Jonah for reminding her of things she had buried to survive. She typed back a short message, "Keep them." He answered with an exhale of relief that clogged the screen. When Jonah drove the coat to the museum to retrieve a box for the curator to inspect, he left the Polaroid and the note carefully folded on top. He imagined them displayed with placards and spotlights, but also feared that exhibition would turn private memory into a spectacle. The curator's office smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, and the curator, a woman with silver hair and an appetite for precise stories, asked gently about provenance. Jonah stammered through half-truths, and then, in a moment of honesty, told her, "They belong to someone I love." Outside, Jonah turned the shoebox in his hands as if deciding whether to lock it back in a drawer or to open it, and read everything like a letter meant for him. He opened it. The Polaroid, the violet, the note, each object felt like a living unit. He read the note again. This time the words hit like a small light. "For when you forget who you are, remember the people who will show up anyway." Jonah looked at the Polaroid and felt in the hollow of his chest the unnameable fact that love is sometimes an accumulation of witness. The act of another person keeping track of you when you lose your own chronology. But others in Clara's orbit were less benevolent. Damien Armitage, a former patron and an old flame who fed on public contradiction like an opiate, began to circulate his own version of Clara's story, that she had used their intimacy as a tool to market empathy. His whispering worked like rot. Invitations began to dry up. Clara, who had once believed that work could be an island, found the sea around it churning with currents she hadn't navigated. And then, abruptly, Clara left. She packed a bag not with the intention of escape, but with the desire to disappear and measure whether absence was a clearer mirror than presence. She folded Jonah's coat, the one with the bound treasures in its pocket, and left it, still with its inner cache, on the railing of the fire escape. She told no one where she went. The city kept its seasons. Rain gave way to a brittle, early winter. Jonah noticed the coat gone the next morning when he reached for it before work and found the rail bare. He felt a hollow that turned into the kind of worry that rearranges a person's priorities. He called Clara's friends. He checked the cafe and the Polaroid. He asked the curator questions he'd avoided until urgency made him brave. No one knew where she had gone. The silence stretched like a drawn wire between them. As weeks became a calendar of missed calls and sporadic messages from people who had seen her passing like a rumor, Jonah became a detective of tenderness. He retraced her steps: the cafe on the receipt, the alley in the Polaroid, the bench where he and Clara had once vowed not to betray each other. Each place yielded small clues and larger gaps. He began leaving notes in the corners of the cafe, folded messages addressed to C, written in crabbed handwriting with sugar stains. He posted photographs of the violet in his workshop window. People noticed a change in him. He was no longer merely practical. He was searching. Clara, in a rented room 2 neighborhoods away, read Jonah's misspelled notes stuck behind the sugar packets where she worked part-time. He never knew she read them, and she never replied. Her absence was an experiment on herself, a way to watch whether the world would continue to decide her worth in her absence or whether she could decide for herself. She wrote letters to herself, long, furious epistles that dismantled the idea of performance and reassembled it as craft. She walked until her feet ached and slept on trains to the edges of the city, where buildings looked more honest for their neglect. The tension built not only between Clara and a world that scrutinized her, but also within each small scene Jonah stitched into existence. The coffee rings on his table, the Polaroid in his wallet. The inner pocket's contents had become a lodestone. When a reporter, sniffing for a new angle, traced Clara's disappearance to a rumor that she had staged a vanishing for publicity, the internet's appetite sharpened. Jonah read the article and felt both anger and an obligation to correct things. He could not fix the narrative entirely. He could, however, show up in the small ways that mattered, by keeping her things safe, by refusing to let rumor repackage a person's life into headlines. The rising action pulled like tide. Each act of small kindness, a note left under a sugar jar, a cup of coffee paid at the cafe in the Polaroid tucked into a book left on a bench mattered because it was concrete. Meanwhile, the world of public opinion churned and threatened to shape Clara's identity for her. Her own silence became both shield and peril. Inside that tension, both Jonah and Clara were changing. Jonah from passive witness to active keeper, Clara from performer of memory to a woman learning the contours of her own truth. The items in that coat pocket followed them like an unspoken contract, a reminder that even in absence, small objects could create a bridge. The confrontation arrived not as a scene of shouting, but as an unadorned, frightening exposure. Damien Armitage, polished, practiced, hungry for confessions that produced traffic, bought a ticket to the museum's opening of a communal exhibit called Traces, Hands That Remember. The show would include objects donated by various citizens, each paired with a story. Jonah, uneasy but compelled, had offered a small corner of the shoebox's contents to the curator. The Polaroid and the note were displayed under glass with a placard that read, unlabeled, "Donor requested anonymity." Clara learned of the exhibit through a friend who sent her a photo of the crowd. She stood on a street lamplit corner, coat buttoned tight, and watched the image of her Polaroid glimmer on screen. People were reading the placard and murmuring. Her stomach convulsed. She decided then she would go. Not to vindicate, not to protest, but to face the artifacts of her own life as if it were a trial she could attend sober. The museum that night buzzed with a crowd that looked hungry for intimacy that felt curated. Damien found her before she entered, a smug cavalryman who believed he had earned the right to rewrite narratives. He crossed the room with a glass of wine, voice lubricated by alcohol and performance. "You always were dramatic, Clara," he said, close enough that his breath smelled like citrus. "Is that yours?" He pointed to the Polaroid. Clara felt the old shame rise like bile. "Yes," she said simply. Damien smiled as if he had all the keys. "People like an origin story. You were good at that, playing the wounded artist. But what about the truth? You were always very good at finding the market in your misery." Before she could answer, Jonah stepped between them. He had worn a plain sweater and carried himself with a kind of steady resolve that felt new. His hand found the shoebox at his side, as if it were an orb he had been charged to guard. "Back off," Jonah said. It was not shouting. It was the kind of sentence that held its weight. People nearby looked up. Damien laughed, not genuinely amused, but to cut the tension, to show he was unafraid. "And who appointed you protector?" "An amateur archivist." Jonah's jaw tightened. "I didn't appoint myself anything. I'm here because these are someone's things, because they aren't yours to weaponize." Damien stepped closer. "You're sentimental. You think objects are virtue." The crowd tightened in a ring. A woman reading a placard whispered behind her hand, "Is this a relationship drama?" The glee for spectacle made Clara feel small. She reached for the glass case's edge and rested her palm on it, as if the museum could act as a wall between her and the hostilities that used to live in her inbox. Damien's next move was the cruelest. He leaned down, as if to offer counsel, and said so that the nearest microphones could catch every syllable. "If you're going to package grief, Clara, at least have the decency to be honest about who benefited from it." The words landed like a slam. Someone in the crowd gasped. Cameras tilted toward the scene. Jonah felt himself splinter. He wanted to argue, to break the glass and show the world the note's private tenderness, but he understood the cruelty of doing so, that to expose vulnerability under a spotlight could be to butcher it. Clara laughed then, a small, sharp sound without mirth. "You think I made a business out of my life," she said, voice steady. "You think people like me can't have a past without it being used against us. You'd rather we be anonymous than complicated." Damien's eyes glittered with victory. "Complicated or contrived, the effect is the same. You sold the room a story." Jonah felt the barricade between them tremble. He could see Clara's face, muscles tight with an effort of composure, and he felt a protective instinct swell, not for romance but for truth. He stepped forward. "You don't get to decide what's contrived and what's real," he said. "That Polaroid, that note, those things are part of someone's life. If you want to attack the work. If you want to attack the person, ask yourself why you think you can." The room hummed. Damien reached for a final blow, an accusation disguised as a question. "Are you herself? Or are you just a performance she picked up along the way?" Clara's breath hitched, and for a second she was a little child hiding behind the coat rack. She thought of the note. "For when you forget who you are, remember the people who will show up anyway." The phrase offered a strange permission. She had been hiding, she realized, not only from critics but from the simpler, more dangerous thing. Herself. She stepped forward. Lights folded time. "I am neither the villain nor the saint you make me out to be," she said, voice quiet and clear. "I am a woman who has been humiliated and who has loved and who has made work out of memory. If that makes you comfortable calling me a performance, that says more about you than me." A murmur went through the room. The curator, who had been watching from a small podium, moved closer with a hand on her lips. Damien's smirk faltered. Then something happened that would change the tenor of the confrontation. A woman from the crowd, older, whose hands had been roughened by decades of work, stepped forward and placed her palm flat onto the glass. She said simply, "This is my mother," and told a brief story of a borrowed coat, of a daughter who had come home late and wrapped herself in other people's warmth. Another man spoke about a photograph he recognized as his own father. The room, hungry for spectacle, began to feel less like an audience and more like a communal body that had been reminded of its shared fragility. Damien, suddenly exposed not as a critic but as an opportunist, retreated to the edges. The crowd's mood softened from hunger to reflection. Clara felt a clarity settle over her like cooling metal. The confrontation had not resolved all things. It had not silenced critics or canceled the rumor mill, but it had unmoored the power Damien had amassed. Jonah stayed close. His presence was not an insistence but a steadying thing. After the crowd dispersed, Clara and Jonah stood alone by the display. In the hush, she looked at him and saw the small trace of worry at the corner of his mouth, which always appeared when he wanted to protect something he loved. "You kept them," she said. Jonah shrugged. "I couldn't not." She smiled then, more private than before, and for a moment the room smelled like violet and the seam of the coat. The confrontation had pushed them to an edge. Neither knew whether they'd step back or leap. But something new existed. An understanding that memory could be defended, not by spectacle or silence, but by the delicate act of holding. The day after the museum opening, the critics' barbed article that had once tried to dent Clara's reputation seemed diminished in the face of a public that now remembered persons rather than spectacles. Social feeds filled with stories of borrowed coats and small acts of kindness. Snippets of the older woman's testimony trended. The narrative that had once made Clara legible as contrived found counter-narratives softening its edges. It did not erase the sting. The doors that had closed did not automatically open again, but it changed the gravity around her. Clara returned to her rented room and unfolded the string of days like laundry. She had expected to be greeted by a vacuum. Instead, she found the shoebox of her own past waiting like an accusation and an invitation at the center of her kitchen table. She sat down and began to take inventory. The Polaroid, which had been on display, felt different in her hands now that she had seen how it lived under glass. Its edges were softened by other people's gaze. The pressed violet crumbled at a petal and left a dusting on her fingertip. She laughed, fragile and new. When Jonah came to see her, he brought a map of small, careful gestures. He showed up with 2 coffees and a quiet patience. There was an awkwardness between them, the kind that comes after words are spoken in public and not all the implications have been aired, but they talked as old friends do. About the weather, about minute annoyances, about the way names fail to hold when we try to pin people down. "You left," Jonah said simply, tasting each word carefully as if he were avoiding salt in a wound. "I needed to see whether people would stop deciding my story for me," Clara replied. "I thought if I left, absence would be a mirror." Jonah's face softened, and it was. She closed her eyes, but it was a cracked one. "I had to stitch it with my own thread." She looked at him. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you. You didn't owe me that." He met her gaze squarely. "But I'm glad you came back." They did not, at first, rush to define their relationship. The falling action in their lives was not a tidy meetup, but a slow resettling. Clara began to rebuild her public self by small steps. A lecture at a community college about the ethics of representation, a longer essay about whose stories we tell and why, and a photo series that shifted focus from nostalgia to shared labor. Images of people at work, hands in basins, the unglamorous rituals that make life. Invitations returned, though not to the same rooms she had known. A different kind of audience emerged, leaner and less hungry for spectacle. Jonah, for his part, found that being present demanded new compromises. He organized a small show in his workshop, not a gallery spectacle but a neighborhood gathering, where ordinary objects were displayed, and people were invited to tell the stories behind them. He called it Pocket Stories, and the sign he painted leaned on a sawhorse outside the door. Neighbors brought things: a matchbox with names carved into it, a bus ticket with a smudged date, a child's drawing folded to tiny size. The workshop filled with conversation, and the act of sharing small things became a quiet reclamation. In the privacy of nights between them, Clara and Jonah navigated tenderness like a new language. Sometimes they failed, and sometimes they succeeded brilliantly. A conversation about an exhibit might end in a fight about honesty. A moment later, they would find themselves laughing because the fight had revealed not a fracture, but a place that needed tending. The Polaroid and the note were no longer mere artifacts. They were talismans that could be set down and picked up as needed, without the panic of their disappearance. She learned to tolerate being seen. The lesson was not a single epiphany, but a series of small experiments. Showing up at the cafe during daylight to talk with people without performing for a camera, answering a difficult question with a quiet, "I don't know," and letting that be enough. Each time she resisted the urge to craft herself into a digestible story, she felt a little more rooted. There were cracks to mend elsewhere. Damien's attempts at public smear had cost her opportunities, and some doors would not reopen. There were patrons she would never work with again. That cost was painful. It was also an honesty she accepted. Clara began to measure success in different ways. Invitations that came with genuine curiosity rather than paparazzi hunger. Students who wrote notes saying her talk had given them permission to tell stories that felt true. Friends who asked for help without tallying what they gave in return. Jonah, too, changed. He had always been practical, a maker who could see the line between raw material and finished object. But the events had taught him to inhabit tenderness as a craft. He became better at listening, better at naming small acts of care. One night, when a storm knocked the power out across their neighborhood, he grabbed a flashlight and a thermos and went to check on Clara. He found her on the living room floor, surrounded by photograph prints she had been reworking. They sat in the flashlight's cone and ate cold pie from a takeout box. In the dark, they spoke of small betrayals and larger hopes. Jonah's hand found hers without much drama, a simple tether. They learned to trust one another differently. The trust was not all about romance. It was about the knowledge that someone would be willing to keep your fragments without turning them into a performance. Jonah kept the shoebox in a drawer but no longer felt the compulsion to hide it. Clara, when the urge to shrink resurfaced, would pull out the note and read it aloud. Its words, which had once been an instruction, had become a reminder. She was allowed to be complicated. She had witnesses who would show up not for applause but to stand. The art world, mercurial as ever, adjusted. New critics arose to take the stage. The internet found a new story to consume. But the people in Clara's immediate orbit, the curator, the older woman with roughened hands, Jonah, the neighbors, continued to live with the nuance of her choices. In a quiet way that mattered more than headlines, her work became steadier. She was no longer performing for validation. She was making because the work itself demanded honesty. Small reconciliations accumulated. A friend invited her to collaborate on a community mural. A student included her photos in a thesis that argued for ethical storytelling. The cafe, whose receipt had been in Jonah's pocket, offered to host an evening where people could bring items and tell the memories behind them. When the cafe owner placed a small framed copy of the Polaroid on a wall, it felt less like exhibition and more like belonging. Through it all, Jonah and Clara rebuilt a rhythm that fit between them. They remained friends with intimacies that allowed for mistakes and apologies. They discovered that love, practiced, is less about triumph and more about the slow ungluing of old armor and the patient construction of new holdfasts. They argued over small things: who would water a neighbor's plant, whether to accept an invitation that felt performative. In each disagreement, they found ways to listen. Months later, when the violet from the inner pocket had faded to a whisper of color, Clara pressed it into a book and wrote on the inside cover, "Not proof of pain, proof of presence." She gave the book to Jonah one afternoon at his workshop. He read her note and closed the book gently. "You left pieces of yourself in all kinds of pockets," he said. "I'm grateful you let me find some." They did not pretend the world would never accuse again. But they had learned to face accusation with a steadier heart and a network of neighbors who had remembered. Memory, they realized, is not a private vault but a shared ledger. Sometimes people hold it for us, sometimes they return it, and sometimes they add notes we could never have written alone. In that ledger, the coat's inner pocket had become a small shrine, a place where the cumulative tenderness of witnesses could be kept safe. Years later, Clara stood in a small gallery not as a spectacle, but as one among many makers. The Polaroid hung on a wall labeled for community artifacts. Beneath it, someone had written in a neat hand, "We are where we are held." The note, faded but legible, lay in a display case with other pieces of ordinary devotion. Visitors read and nodded, and a child asked her mother what it meant to be held. The mother's answer, "People remember you when you forget yourself," was the kind of translation Clara had learned to live by. Jonah visited often, his hands still bearing the calluses of his craft. They walked slowly together through the exhibit, past other people's pockets and the small epics they contained. It was not an arrival so much as a settling, the kind that comes when old storms have been weathered and new seasons are possible. Clara reached into her coat and found nothing more than lint and a bus token. She smiled. She had left pieces of herself in that coat and in other people. She had also found what she had once misplaced, a steady interior life that could bear scrutiny and return to joy. In the pockets of countless others, she saw traces of the same truth. We scatter parts of ourselves, and sometimes, if we are lucky, someone gathers them and keeps them safe until we can pick them up again.